committed firefighters from the town of Sutherland.
The honourable member for Clare Digby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's appropriate to rise today on the day that we tabled accessibility legislation to recognize Chief Freddie Muse of the Hecknooga Fire Department. In doing so, I only want to recognize his 38 years of service at the fire department, also to highlight the efforts to raise funds for a cause close to his heart, muscular dystrophy. You see, Chief Muse has muscular dystrophy and is the only fire chief in Canada confined to a wheelchair. Despite this, he goes out to every call and instructs his team over the radio. In addition to these responsibilities, Chief Muse has been involved in a number of MD fundraisers, including a bass fishing tournament and last July a ladder-thon in Chiefs riding. Please join me in thanking Chief Muse for his years of service and all the volunteering and all those that helped him in the ladder-thon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night, the Premier basically admitted that he has no idea how to handle the teachers' impasse, Mr. Speaker, when he said, and I quote directly, "How we are here, I am not sure." I'll table that quote for the benefit of the House. Mr. Speaker, this admission speaks volumes about how this government has messed up the negotiations with teacher, bringing us to the possibility of the first strike in our province's history. The Premier has missed every reasonable opportunity to get an off-ramp where he can sit down and talk to teachers and work this out, which is what every parent and student wants to see happen. Mr. Speaker, now that he's missed the most recent reasonable way of working out his differences with teachers, will the Premier tell us what is his plan now to avoid a strike?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. As he knows, leading up to this strike, we've heard across the province that it was about classrooms. I did express last night, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure how we're here. We spent $65 million putting back into the classroom, hiring more teachers, math mentors, Mr. Speaker, reading specialists. We put in new programs. We've gone through to continue to make sure we try to improve the learning environment in the classroom. Mr. Speaker, what I expressed last night was my genuine feeling that we were responding to what we believe teachers were looking for in their classroom, and it was an honest expression, Mr. Speaker. I don't think anyone can fault their Premier for providing the honest expression.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we don't doubt the Premier's honesty that he has no idea what to do now. That's actually the problem. And he showed it again. The more he spouts those lines that, quite frankly, no one is buying, the closer we get every day to a strike, Mr. Speaker. The Premier told parents and students that he wanted to work with teachers. He had a golden opportunity handed to him when the teachers asked to put this all before a conciliation board, but rather than make that work, he chose to play political games, Mr. Speaker, and missed the opportunity. Parents and students are counting on the Premier to find a way to work this out, as has always been done without a strike. How can they trust him now when he messed up such an obvious, reasonable way to work out his differences with teachers?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, the Honourable Member is confused. We agreed to go to the Conciliation Board, Mr. Speaker, and the Honourable Member has been told that multiple times in this House. As a matter of fact, I tabled in this House yesterday the very thing the Teachers Union acknowledged they were the ones that were not going to the Conciliation Board. We're continuing to prepare to sit down and talk about how do we move forward and make the classroom and learning environment better. The Minister of Education has been reaching out, talking to teachers. I've been meeting with teachers. We're going to continue to do so. But, Mr. Speaker, they gave their union a strike mandate, and now the union will have to determine what is next for them. We were prepared to go to this board. They said no.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, quite honestly, it's the Premier that's confused. The teachers asked for the Conciliation Board. It's him and his government that said no. The fact that they were not able to reach agreement on conditions is, quite frankly, a sideshow. What the facts are is that the teachers asked for a conciliation board. That request went to the Minister of Labour. The government did not respond with a yes. They said no. That's why there's no conciliation board, Mr. Speaker. It's as simple as that. The Premier admitted last night he had no idea how he got here. Now I hope we've cleared that up for all time, Mr. Speaker. The point is, no more political games. Parents don't want political games. Will the Premier commit today? No more games. Just get back to the table and work this out with teachers.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. Again, I want to remind him that it was teachers who chose not to go to the table, Mr. Speaker. We continue to focus on the things that we've been told by teachers across this room as classroom conditions. We're going to continue to focus on that, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to focus on kids, Mr. Speaker. It's my hope. I want teachers to be standing in front of students, Mr. Speaker. That's my hope there will be. Mr. Speaker, they've given the union executive a strong mandate, the same union executive that negotiated 2 separate deals that they said no to, Mr. Speaker. Now they're going to have to rely on what that union executive is going to do about whether or not to strike or not.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier also. Mr. Speaker, this government has decided to play politics with the public sector contracts. The Nova Scotia Teachers Union has requested the Conciliation Board, but unfortunately, the 2 sides were unable to agree on conditions around this process. This government's refusal to participate in the collective bargaining process is moving all of us closer to the first ever province-wide teachers' strike. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask the Premier to stop playing politics and agree to a bargain in good faith with the teachers.
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to remind the Honourable Member, we went to the bargaining table with teachers. We came to a negotiated agreement, Mr. Speaker. Their own lawyer has sent a letter to every teacher across this province telling him that when we were at the bargaining table on 2 separate occasions that we ended up getting a negotiated settlement. Mr. Speaker, that is bargaining. I will grant him this, Mr. Speaker. We didn't roll over. We bargained on behalf of the citizens of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we provided what we believe is a fair wage increase, one that recognizes, Mr. Speaker, the hard work the teachers are doing across this province. At the same time, we've continued to invest in classrooms and replace the $65 million that party took out of classrooms, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to make sure, Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to make sure we stay focused on kids.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, when I asked yesterday about the collective bargaining, the Premier said we all have to do our part of this solution. And he told the teachers, and I quote, "The growth of your benefits have to slow down," end quote. This is the message that he has for teachers, for nurses, and frontline workers. But it seems they have a very different set of rules for himself and those working in his inner circle. Mr. Speaker, we all have to do our part for this particular solution. So what is the Premier doing to be part of the solution?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. As he knows, that under this government, Mr. Speaker, there has been no increase in salaries, Mr. Speaker. He also knows that the transition allowance that was afforded to members has gone as of a year ago, Mr. Speaker. Those are all real challenges, and all members who have been here for a period of time, Mr. Speaker, have made a contribution towards that. What we're asking for is that across the entire public sector, Mr. Speaker, that what we have is an increase. No one is losing any benefits, Mr. Speaker. Their long service award is staying intact. We just said we can't continue to allow it to grow. It's unreasonable to suggest. It's unreasonable to suggest, Mr. Speaker, that we provide a bonus for those Nova Scotians that are going into the best pension plans we have in our province. It's just simply unreasonable to ask 70% of the population, Mr. Speaker, to contribute to give a bonus to those who are in the best pensions we have. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we provided a modest increase in salary, I believe, that reflects this province's ability to pay. At the same time, he made a choice. His party made a choice. They gave a 7.5% pay raise and cut money and took money from kids in classrooms. We've made a different choice.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This government has certainly painted itself into an ugly corner. They have passed legislation that proclaimed would set teachers' wages. The Premier has said that arbitration is not an option, and this government will not agree to continue negotiations through Conciliation Board unless certain conditions are completely off the table. This is not, however, in my view, Mr. Speaker, and my colleagues, collective bargaining when it works. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier admit that he's made a mistake and repeal Bill 148?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I have said in this House to the Leader of the Conservative Party time and time again, we were prepared to go to the Conciliation Board, Mr. Speaker. It was teachers who said no.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier has now lost 3 senior staff members to ethical violations. His Chief of Staff had to leave because he had disclosed private personal health information. Director of Communications had to leave because he had been charged with a domestic assault. As of yesterday, an outreach officer with the Liberal caucus had to leave because he conspired to get taxpayers' money from Richmond County and have it delivered to the Richmond Liberal Association bank account, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Premier, why does he have such a serious ethical problem in his own office?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank all those Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, who accept opportunity to serve the public, whether it's in the Premier's office or caucus offices or constituency offices across this province, Mr. Speaker. Every Nova Scotian, Mr. Speaker, who enters into public life does so wanting to serve the interests of their community to make this province a better place. And I want to thank all those, not only those who've come to work for me, Mr. Speaker, but all those who've stepped up to support whatever political party or whatever way they believe they can serve public office to improve the lives of those in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Premier doesn't thank people for disclosing private health information or thank them for conspiring to take taxpayers' money from Richmond County and put it in the Richmond Liberal bank account, or thank them for committing a domestic assault, even though he hires them back quietly when they commit that offence, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure he doesn't mean to thank people who commit those kinds of offences. Yes, they're in a position of public trust. Yes, we need people to take positions of public trust, but we also have to hold them accountable when they violate that public trust, as is happening repeatedly in his office, Mr. Speaker. Maybe this is another example of where his answer is, I don't know how we got here, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, in this case, does he truly prefer to be left in the dark, or is he even aware of the pattern that is now coming out of his own office?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Again, I want to thank all those Nova Scotians who continue to respond to the needs of Nova Scotians. I also want to acknowledge, Mr. Speaker, those Nova Scotians who, when they've made a mistake, accept the responsibility of those mistakes, Mr. Speaker, in this House. The only member in this House, the member across, who continues to stand in this House pessimistic about the future of this province, continuing to condemn Nova Scotians, continue to look at the glass half full.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Continue to be negative is not the expression that I get when I go out and see Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. They will stand up. Those Nova Scotians that stood up and accept it, Mr. Speaker, when they were wrong. I look forward to that member standing up and telling Nova Scotians time after time when he's been wrong.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was the Premier and the Liberal government and the Liberal Party that promised Nova Scotians in the last election a doctor for every Nova Scotian. And tens of thousands of Nova Scotians are without a doctor today, Mr. Speaker. Instead of spending their time and effort finding those physicians, they amalgamated the district health authorities, Mr. Speaker. Last week, a high-ranking official with the health authority said that every community cannot expect a family doctor. So I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, when will the Minister of Health table a list of communities like Weymouth that will no longer have a doctor?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. He knows the strengths of a collaborative practice model for this province. We've begun that journey to look after Nova Scotians with the appropriate healthcare provider at the right time, and our recruitment is continuous. Member opposite also knows that we have many situations now where we're actually having to hire 2 doctors to replace one of our doctors who are leaving practice and had 2,000 to 3,000 patients. Our new graduates are going to serve more in the 1,200, 1,300 patient load.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But what I do know is the benefit of issuing billing codes to physicians who want to go to communities like Weymouth. The residents of Weymouth have worked hard to get to a point where they're asking for the ability to do that, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, will the Premier tell Nova Scotians how the government is deciding which communities no longer will have billing numbers issued by the Nova Scotia Health Authority?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the honourable for the question. I want to thank the member from Clare Digby, who's been working extremely hard with communities across that province. The honourable member knows there's a physician currently working in Weymouth along with a nurse practitioner. We know there are challenges in communities across the province. What we've heard from healthcare providers is that they want to work in a collaborative practice model. We're working with those communities to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to provide that services. There's been a number of steps that were brought in by Dow Medical School, Dr. Tom Mary, when the Rural Residency Program, which we're now starting to see the fruits of the benefit of that program. And through that, Mr. Speaker, we'll be able to build a collaborative practice team around communities across Nova Scotia. The announcement around the number of nurse practitioners and family practice nurses are all positive signs to continue to make sure that we're providing the environment where healthcare providers want to work.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Richmond expense scandal is now impacting government employees. Today I have a question for the Minister responsible for Tourism Nova Scotia. Anne Delory, a seasonal worker at the Visitor Information Centre in Port Hastings, is a member of the Taxpayers of Richmond County Facebook group. Like many others in that group, she has expressed her opinions about Richmond County politics. Mrs. Delory received a letter from her employer, this government, not to be making comments they viewed to be political. And I can table that letter. Mr. Speaker, is the Minister of Business now implicating himself in this mess by threatening the free speech of Nova Scotians who are upset with the way this government has handled the Richmond scandal?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. I don't know the specifics of what my colleague is referencing. Certainly more than prepared to speak with her and access that information, but let me say this, Mr. Speaker, we all have a responsibility to be transparent, and I'd be more than willing to work with my colleague to get to the root of her concern.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am deeply concerned that the minister is not aware of this. I mean, this letter would be very threatening. I know if I received it myself. So, you know, Mrs. Delory did not make her comments during the months she was working. She did not make them to visitors. The policy actually states employees shall not make partisan political comments when speaking or writing as a public service employee. So, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that she made these comments as a free citizen, not as an employee. So why is the Minister in Tourism Nova Scotia threatening to fire? I believe she should have an apology.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I just want to clarify for my colleague, Tourism Nova Scotia, if this is where this correspondence originated from, is an independent Crown corporation, Mr. Speaker. I've had no discussion with Tourism Nova Scotia relative to this individual or this subject, but again would be more than willing to work with my colleague specific to the circumstances she shared and find some common ground on that position.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Municipal Affairs. The minister's tune on municipal government audits have changed. First, they were not an efficient use of money. Now, after the Liberal government has been rocked by scandal, he says he is considering a random audit of other municipalities. A random selection, though, Mr. Speaker, may overlook some of the more troubling hotspots and political problems for the Liberals, and I consider this somewhat convenient. Mr. Speaker, will any audit of other municipalities in the province include Guysborough County, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we haven't made a decision on how to proceed with that. What we've indicated is we're not interested in doing a wholesale forensic audit of 50 municipal units. I think the millions of dollars associated with that, we can all agree in this House, would not be efficient. Municipalities do go through audits every year. They provide us with audited statements and management letters. That actually led to the red flags that had developed in Richmond County. What I did indicate is that we are open to various options that were presented by the Ombudsman's Office. We are giving those full consideration, Mr. Speaker, because we do want to make all municipal governments fully accountable and transparent, and we're moving forward with our municipal partners to actually put all those expenses online, Mr. Speaker, because we know the best disinfectant is sunlight, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, the Ombudsman is currently investigating Guysborough County for its own expense scandal. Despite being asked, the minister has not said whether he has discussed the allegations of impropriety in Guysborough with his cabinet colleague, the former warden of Guysborough County. Since government has been so reluctant, Mr. Speaker, to release information, will the minister commit today to releasing the findings of the Ombudsman's report as soon as he receives it? Yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, the Ombudsman's office is an independent office of our government, Mr. Speaker. The Ombudsman made the previous report public, Mr. Speaker, and we expect that to happen next time around. I mean, to have that party continually infer that this government and our executive branch of government has the power to direct the courts, to direct the RCMP, to direct the Ombudsman's office, I find very concerning, Mr. Speaker, and I really want the members opposite to contemplate what those actions actually mean for the sake of our democracy, Mr. Speaker, and the powers that shouldn't be in Executive Council.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, students in Nova Scotia graduate on average with $39,000 in student debt. Tuition fees in Nova Scotia are the second highest in the country. This government has allowed fees to increase by as much as 37%, and now almost 20% fewer Nova Scotians are pursuing a university degree here at home compared to just 10 years ago, and I will table that. So I asked the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is he concerned that fewer students are remaining in Nova Scotia because of his government tuition fees increases?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. As he would know, under the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education, Mr. Speaker, we removed interest off of student loans that was being compounded on top of that. You would also know, Mr. Speaker, that we introduced legislation for Nova Scotia students who graduate, Mr. Speaker, in a 4-year cycle, that we will forgive the Nova Scotia portion of their student loan. And we've also said, Mr. Speaker, we've also said to Nova Scotians with disabilities, Mr. Speaker, that we understand it may take you longer than 4 years to finish that degree, that we will provide you with 10-year opportunity, and at the end of those 10 years, we'll forgive the Nova Scotia portion of student loans.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what's about to happen here is a lesson in listening. Mr. Speaker, students would not be marching outside right now if post-secondary education would be affordable. They are not out there celebrating. They are sending a message to all of us here in this particular legislature, particularly the government, is not making the proper investments. This government has cut $50 million in financial assistance to graduates. Meanwhile, provinces like New Brunswick and Ontario are moving to make tuition free. I repeat, free for more students. That is a clear difference. So I asked the Premier, why should Nova Scotia young people study here when they can receive a more affordable education from the start in other provinces?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member. He would know students across the country are marching on legislatures across the country today. This is a national awareness for students, Mr. Speaker. He would also know that if you're a Nova Scotia student and that you complete your university degree in 4 years, we will forgive your Nova Scotia portion of student debt, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier, we're continuing to work to make sure that we continue to provide opportunities. He also mentioned about, I think he's talking about the graduate rebate program, Mr. Speaker, that we've repurposed some of that money, Mr. Speaker, in graduate opportunities where we're seeing hundreds of Nova Scotians being given job opportunity here in our province, Mr. Speaker. We're seeing those very university graduates, Mr. Speaker, getting their first job opportunity under our government in Nova Scotia, unlike when the Democratic Party was in it. They were leaving, Mr. Speaker, not for their education, Mr. Speaker. They were leaving to build a life somewhere else in Canada. Under this government, Mr. Speaker, they're being educated in Nova Scotia, and they're building their life in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. I recently received a copy of the feedback report from the Dartmouth General Hospital's design camp. The document states that in considering construction at the hospital, operational leadership of the Health Department and the Health Authority were not supportive of consultant recommendations that the majority of rooms be private. This was despite previous information which had been provided indicating shared rooms are associated with greater infection risk. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister be following the consultant recommendation to ensure the majority of new beds are private rooms to ensure the best level of infection protection?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I would say to the member opposite that I'm pleased with the work that's taking place on the third and fourth floors, which were the recommendation of the Auditor General to make sure that infection control was indeed at the highest level, and that work is now 60 to 70% complete. We will start the fifth floor in the spring, and the matter raised by the member opposite is one that I will certainly take a look at.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it seems his department staff have already spoken on his behalf. In the document, which I'll table, the consultants talk a lot about the discussion with the province, and they say, quote, although discussion of the financial impact of not maintaining wardrooms included the potential loss of revenue stream, it did not include discussion around the cost savings and efficiencies derived from single-use rooms. Mr. Speaker, why is the Minister of Health allowing people representing him and the government to prioritize revenue streams over infection control?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know that the whole design of the fifth floor, the new surgical tower, the ambulatory care, infection control will be top of mind, top of design as that work moves forward, and I'm pleased to say that that work will be underway March of 2017.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
A question for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Mr. Speaker, in Richmond we have a forensic audit of about $800,000 where there are 440 out of 603 transactions that are not supported with proper receipts. The Minister indicated in the Cape Breton Post, he was quoted as saying, we want the public to have full confidence in their municipal institutions. Mr. Speaker, many Nova Scotians have lost confidence in this government and the role they played in pretending these inappropriate spending practices weren't happening in Richmond. How does the Minister expect Nova Scotians to have faith in this government's spot checks when they have people they need to protect, like the employee who was in their caucus office until yesterday?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I absolutely do reject the premise of that, and I do find it offensive for that member to suggest that level of intent here. The Department of Municipal Affairs has been active on this. We were made aware of some red flags from the annual auditing report that all municipalities have to go through, and we did move into action, recognizing that this is an independent organization, an independent level of government who is duly elected and autonomous, Mr. Speaker. We moved in to try and provide advice. We offered a consultant to go in, courtesy of the province, to help them solve their financial management issues. I'll table 2 letters in that regard, Mr. Speaker. That was offered at full price by the province. We would cover that, and unfortunately that offer was rejected, Mr. Speaker. But to suggest we were not active on this, I think is very unfair, and I think it's important that we recognize, Mr. Speaker, this was decisions made by a group of people. They were reimbursing themselves, it appears, for things that shouldn't have been reimbursed, and I think those individuals need to be held to account, and through these investigative processes, I believe they will be.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
The problem with the Minister's answer is that this government, including the Minister himself, have been in conversations with people. This has been well known, Mr. Speaker. This has been going on for a long time. It wasn't until the Ombudsman that got involved, that this government got involved. Mr. Speaker, batting .270 would get you near the top of the batting order if you were playing for the Petit de Gras Red Caps. But, Mr. Speaker, it equals pure corruption, if that's your record, for proper receipts for expenses, as is the case in Richmond. So, Mr. Speaker, We have an ombudsman conducting audits of municipalities because there's no mechanism set up as a standard to do so, and because the government ignored the concerns of the citizens in Richmond. Mr. Speaker, it's gotten to the point we have the RCMP investigating. Will the minister hand over the responsibility for conducting municipal audits to Nova Scotia's Auditor General by requesting it, giving the authority under legislation, and providing necessary resources?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do appreciate the question. I appreciate the ire behind the question. We share that frustration here. This was an issue of localized government appearing to make reimbursements that they shouldn't have been reimbursed for on a wide range of things, Mr. Speaker. We are considering a number of options, Mr. Speaker, including an Auditor General for municipalities. That is an option being considered. We had not landed on direction on that yet. But the one thing we are focused on, and we'll move forward quickly, is working with our municipal partners to bring all expenses online, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that every single municipal unit in this province is held to the same high standard of this House, Mr. Speaker. And for that member to suggest that that's not taking action, I think is absolutely ridiculous.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education and Childhood Development. Today, taxpayers learned that their tax dollars will be used to purchase 12 20-year-old schools at a price tag of over $86 million. This news comes at a time when the minister is embroiled in an impasse with the teachers' union about classroom improvements. My question to the minister: I realize we have to have schools in order to have classrooms. However, how can the minister tell Nova Scotians there is no money for classroom improvements and at the same time find $86 million for schools we have been leasing for 20 years?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite, I'm not sure what part of the dialogue over the last 3 years he has missed, but we certainly are the government that has invested heavily in programs for students.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I've also talked to hundreds of teachers, and these improvements, many of them are not reaching the classrooms, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, successful Auditor Generals have criticized the Liberal P3 school scheme for a large number of problems. In some cases, the auditor said it was unclear if school boards and schools were getting all the services they were entitled to, or whether payments to the developers provided good value for money. My question to the minister: what steps has the minister taken to avoid repeating the mistakes of the P3 school scheme in the future?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the decision to purchase 12 of the schools, the announcement that was made today, was twofold. It was, as we know, the lease is coming to an end in 2020. A decision had to be made and notify the partner what our intention was. We recognize that it's in the best interest of taxpayers' dollars to purchase rather than to continue a lease. We know that these schools provide quality spaces. We know that the boards have indicated that they need these schools to deliver program, and at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we will own those schools.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 700 Nova Scotians turn 65 each month in our province, and the need for long-term care will continue to grow as our population ages. And of course, since forming government, Mr. Speaker, we know that the current Liberal government has placed a moratorium on construction of new long-term care beds. Mr. Speaker, this government likes to talk about their investment in home care, but I'd like to ask the Minister of Health, what are they doing to address the needs for long-term care beds in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the member opposite, who is a former minister, knows that we have the highest number of long-term care beds per capita in Canada right now, and he knows that
order, please.
Almost.
The Honourable Minister of Health has the floor.
and he knows that Nova Scotians want to first and foremost stay in their homes. We are investing and have invested $59 million in home care. We're now down to almost a just-in-time home care service, first province in Canada to reach that goal.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, we have one of the oldest provinces in the country. There's a reason for that, Mr. Speaker, when we need investment in long-term care. This government applauds themselves, pats themselves on the back for kicking people off the wait list for long-term care, Mr. Speaker. But if you look at the time people are waiting to get access to long-term care beds, hasn't really changed in 3 years, Mr. Speaker. It's way too long. The median length of time is about 340 days, Mr. Speaker, a year. A year to get into a long-term care facility. Mr. Speaker, what is the government's plan to make sure that Nova Scotians can gain access to long-term care beds when they need it, Mr. Speaker, rather than wait a year or more in the province like we're seeing today?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I'm pleased to say is that the policy is working very well. If someone is called and they're not ready to go in a home, yes, they come off the wait list. But what's really important, Mr. Speaker, is that should something happen to them during that time they're off the list, they become immediately the highest priority, and they do get to a nursing home. Our plan, Mr. Speaker, is that we will reduce the length of stay in a nursing home by providing high-quality at-home care.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also for the Minister of Health. As a result of $8 million in budget cuts to long-term care homes, they're forced to cut staff, cut food items, baths, repairs, maintenance, all these types of things. So when asked this morning at Public Accounts as to how they could be certain that the budget cuts are not impacting the quality of care, both department staff and health authority staff said that they rely on inspections. There's inspections of the homes to make sure that quality is not impacted. Meanwhile, in September, the Auditor General's report had suggested that health and wellness does not evaluate, one of the shortcomings that the Auditor General found was that health and wellness does not evaluate how service providers are performing. On the one hand, you have the staff.
Does the member have a question?
We rely on inspections. The other hand, you have the Auditor General.
Does the member have a question?
Yes. How can the minister reconcile the department saying one thing and the Auditor General saying another?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think the member opposite will know that the Auditor General is talking about the number of contacts. We currently do an announced visit to homes. We do unannounced visits to home, and depending on what the nature of the issue is, in fact, we can also provide an inspection through unknown people going into the nursing home, looking at the quality of care that residents are receiving. We also deal with loved ones of those in a nursing home to make sure that quality care is there at all times.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But meanwhile, the Auditor General, as much as the Minister says that, the Auditor General is saying that health and wellness has not provided written guidance to the inspectors. So they don't have any real way to evaluate the services being provided. They have no written procedures for the inspectors. We have nurses in long-term care facilities calling their work conditions deplorable. 64% of them have said that they've considered quitting in the past year. These are not good signs, Mr. Speaker, and there's only certain places that you can cut your budget. Some of your costs are fixed, you can't cut those. Your variable ones you can try and cut. There's not that much room. Is the minister's message to Nova Scotians today that the state of long-term care as it stands today is as good as it's going to get?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We, in the province, we have some outstanding administrators who make sure sure that even though there may be a reduction, that the quality of food, the number of nurses, the number of CCAs are in fact following the policy of the department. And what we know, and what I can tell the member opposite and all Nova Scotians, is that we take the Broken Homes report of the Nova Scotia Nurses Union very seriously. We're now working with the Nova Scotia Nurses Union with workers' compensation to make sure that that nurses and all those who work in our nursing homes go to work and have a safe environment.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In today's public accounts, the Health Authority staff confirmed that during the last year, 852 people died while waiting for a spot in long-term care. They're coming off the wait list because they're dying, Mr. Speaker. Meanwhile, we're facing yet another delay. We're facing yet another delay in the release of the continuing care strategy. Members opposite will remember this continuing care strategy as the one they promised within 100 days of being elected. Last week, the minister said his strategy would be out in the fall. This morning, the Deputy Minister said it would be fall 2017. I guess we should have asked which fall, Mr. Speaker. When will this government start to make the release of the long-term care strategy a priority?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When we came to government, we first of all had to move the first strategy of 2006 forward because it had made no developments around a dementia strategy, acquired brain injury strategy. Those are the areas, in fact, that we have moved forward and we know will serve Nova Scotians extremely well.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Oh, yes, Mr. Speaker, but the strategy was promised in 100 days, and that was 3 years ago. And meanwhile, we have this government boasting about reductions in waiting lists. We just know that over 800 people, those passed away waiting for long-term care. Over 600 of them were taken off the list because of policy changes. You do the math, Mr. Speaker. This government has only added 12 long-term bed cares in the 3 years. We haven't even started consultations yet on the continuing care strategy. Maybe I'll ask the manager just a straight-up question. When will consultations on the continuing care strategy start?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can say is that the staff of our continuing care branch work overtime because it is one of the most demanding areas in the Department of Health, and we are trying to finish off the original strategy before we move to a new strategy, one that will outline for 5 years what those in continuing care will have. And one of the things that's very obvious about the member opposite, Mr. Speaker, is that he cannot stand good news.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Education and Early Years. Childcare providers across the province are voicing their concerns about the recent changes the government has made to their funding. When the minister decided to set wage and cap fees, centres were sent a threatening letter telling them to get on board if they wanted to continue to receive government grants. This seems to be a pattern in the government's relationship with educators in this province. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the minister, what is the minister doing to address concerns that childcare centres may have to close?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if I could just speak to the relationship that we currently have with our early childhood sector. We did a review during the last year, came up with a number of recommendations. The most alarming and the most in need of attention had to do with some of the legacy of the previous government, where we had early childhood educators who were the lowest paid in Canada. We had hundreds of low-income families who were not able to access childcare because they couldn't afford to pay the difference between what operators were charging and what the fee was. So we immediately recognized those were in crisis. We needed to respond to those, and, Mr. Speaker, we did.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you very much for that answer. Mr. Speaker, when the Minister announced changes in the spring, childcare providers welcomed the news that government was interested in making sure they had enough money to pay all staff a fair wage. Unfortunately, the plan was rolled out without discussion with the sector. The result is that many workers have seen no wage increase, and long-serving educators are feeling disrespected. So, Mr. Speaker, what does the Minister have to say to early childhood educators who did not receive the much-deserved increase they were promised?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would agree with something that the member has said, that when we started talking to the sector, they were interested because, Mr. Speaker, and I will table this, but I would like to share with you the significant decrease in funding that went to the child care sector during the previous government. In 2010-11, it was $61 million, and it dropped to 57 the next year, it dropped to 56 the next year, it dropped to 52 the next year. That's the kind of attention and care that that government gave to the sector. We immediately turned that around, 56 million, 58 million, 65 million, and we will continue, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. In my former life, I officiated at approximately 600 celebration of life services. Now, some of those were people, very small minority were people, even one is too many, were misdiagnosed or did not have a test done soon enough. I don't want to blame any one person for this, but I think the system might cause some of the difficulties. Doctors are being overworked because we don't have enough of them. We all know that. To have a test done that might make a difference, it's delayed even to the point of being too late. An operation might be in order, but when the operation takes place, it may be months or years down the road. We know the problems regarding...
Does the member have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is, what is the status of machinery and technicians within the system?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. One of the areas that we have started to not just take a look at but change policy around is actually using that very expensive equipment of scanners and MRIs in the evening. We now have scheduled appointments for people outside of the traditional day of 8 to 4, 8 to 5, and this is one of the reasons why now our MRI wait list has been coming down steadily since last September when this policy was introduced. Also, of course, by combining the 9 districts into one, we're able to utilize that diagnostic equipment that is close by, that used to be in another district and never have access to. We're now using the province in terms of its resources.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mentioned the other day that a 95-year-old lady went to emergency because of a fall, and after 6 days of thinking that it might be a stroke or something else, she finally had an x-ray done and found that she broke her neck. This kind of thing is something that shouldn't happen. So I guess my question is there any money available to increase the number of scans, MIRs, x-ray machines that the province really needs to get a lot of this looked after?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Again, one of the improvements that we have made at the QE2 is, in fact, procure through the foundation, through the department, the latest MRI machine that's also being used for research. But what it's been able to do is dramatically increase the number of MRIs per month now that we have at the Halifax Infirmary. So we continue to make both policy changes, investment in diagnostic equipment, and what I can assure assure the member opposite is that we are working full out to make sure that we provide all Nova Scotians with high-quality care.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is also to the Minister of Health. In the past year, a number of incidents have been made public regarding violence, injury, and unfortunately sometimes death caused by violence in the province's nursing homes. The public, the Minister and the media all expressed the need for such matters to be public. The Minister said, I absolutely believe in 100% in transparency of any death. My question to the Minister, since these such situations were brought to the attention of the public, how many violence-related deaths have been occurred in nursing homes in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure of the exact number. I know there has been one or two. What I can tell the member opposite that's very, very important to nursing homes, to all who work there, and to Nova Scotians and their families is that we have taken the Broken Homes report put out by the Nova Scotia Nurses Union very, very seriously. They've had their first meetings to, in fact, decide what should be the top 3 or 4 recommendations that they have made out of the 15. So to have Aware Nova Scotia, the Nova Scotia Nurses Union, Department of Health, Nova Scotia Health Authority, all of the bodies and groups involved now working on how they can take concrete measures and steps to improve the workplace, the nursing home in this case. In terms of making...
the Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister cited one reason for assessing the violent trends was to ensure that seniors were in fact placed in the appropriate units. The program in place for all nursing home facility staff has only received 40% pickup rate in the past. Meanwhile, budget cuts to nursing homes is causing a flux in staff numbers, and quite frankly, Nova Scotia seniors deserve more. So my question to the Minister is, did your government consider the impacts of staffing cuts and patient safety when implementing the reduction in funding?
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to opposition business. The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can you call private members' public bills for second reading?
We'll now call private members' public bills for second reading.
Can you call bill number 34?
Now call bill number 34. The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to stand in, especially after we've had a vigorous debate on the last probably 20 minutes of question period revolving around long-term care, continuing care, and especially after having a long discussion with the Auditor General's office or with public accounts when we had the Department of Health before us, the Deputy Minister of Health and I believe the CEO of the Health Authority here talking about